Sydney. Hey, hey. Hey, Alyssa, welcome. We're gonna get I'm gonna get started in just about 30 seconds. Hey, Katie, welcome in. Jules, good day. Happy Friday. All right, Jules, you know the drill. Can you see this? All right. Can always count on you. Do. All right, we will go ahead and get started as folks continue to trickle in here. This is another installation of our Podchaser webinar series. We've had a couple weeks off, couple months off actually, as folks are hopefully enjoying their summers. A lot of different holidays falling on Fridays, and hopefully everybody's gearing up for the back to school season, which is right around the corner. So I'm actually really excited about this topic in particular because it's something that we've been working on for the last 3, 4 months, and we're finally now able to kind of unveil it to the greater Podchaser Pro audience population. So, a couple things to note. We'll go through this step by step. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of questions, so you can either pop those in the chat as we go through the deck, or if you want to save those for the end, I'm going to try to have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And of course, our wonderful client success managers are in the room as well. So if you have any particular specific questions, feel free to ask Jules, John, or Sydney. But teeing this thing up here. So most of you know Podchaser as the podcast database, right? We have 6 million shows, we have audience demographics, we have reach information, we have contacts. And oftentimes, when we think about Podchaser Pro, it's primarily through the earned media lens, specifically through the podcast guest booking lens. Let's find a show. We've got a client that wants to appear on podcasts. We know roughly what their reach parameters look like. We know what types of audiences they want to hit. We're going to use a bunch of different filters within Podchaser Pro to identify the best fit shows. Maybe we're using things like content, context, audience, and reach to identify these shows. Maybe we're using the 4A's framework to understand the angle from which the podcast is approaching their content. We're marrying that to our client's angle that they're approaching content, actionable, analytical, anthropological, or aspirational, jogging hopefully some memories if you've joined us for previous webinars. But what's really interesting about all of this is when you move from like a show by show basis as you're constructing campaigns and now zooming out a little bit more and looking at kind of the overall podcast world, you can start to understand some really interesting things. And we've been working on this, like I said, for the last 3 or 4 months. And what this has helped us do is identify some really interesting ways to marry the whole breadth and width of the podcast universe with very specific, very client by client types of focuses or category focuses. So that's really what we're going to be unpacking today. What can podcast data actually tell you? And this goes a little bit further beyond just like the pure find a podcast, pitch a podcast, hopefully get a response, get your client the interview, and keep running that play. So again, this is kind of like the how I want to frame it up. So we promised as part of the promotion of this, we'd explain what a Podchaser Intelligence Read is. And this intelligence read is kind of all the things that I've been talking about. So moving from just a pure guest booking play to now understanding the totality of podcasts, generally speaking. So there's three kind of points of emphasis here. We're going to explain what a Podchaser Intelligence Read is, the capability, why the podcast ecosystem is even readable. We're going to do a real podcast intelligence read. So this is one that I pulled in advance. It's pseudo live. We'll talk through why that is. And then we're also going to unpack what that means for you and how you can use it in your day to day as you are navigating the podcast landscape. So, again, big picture wise, every brand, person, story, topic that you care about is already being talked about on podcasts. And there's over 6 million shows. We'll get into some of the data here in a second. But your category, your competitors, your clients' competitors, your customers, they're in conversations right now. It's been difficult to find those conversations historically for a number of reasons. One is audio is a very intentional medium. It's not like social media where everything is text-based. Audio is, of course, audio-based. Podcasts are audio-based. So what really changed as like the catalyst for enabling these intelligence reads is the expansion of Podchaser's transcript universe. So for the last couple of years, we had transcribed the top 20,000 podcasts globally. Roughly 80-90% of that was with US based podcasts. And then if you've been following along, we expanded our transcription universe significantly towards the end of Q1, early Q2 of 2026. So this is where we start to see some of the timelines match up. We've been working on this for 3 or 4 months. It kind of goes hand in hand with our transcript expansion project as well. So now you can take something that is ephemeral, such as audio, and have it live a little bit more statically through text-based. And when we can do text-based querying, it allows us to do significantly more things. And you marry the text-based transcription analysis with all of the rich, robust audience data, reach data, category data. Now all of a sudden we can start kind of conjuring some very interesting insights and data. So the problem, of course, as we've outlined it here, is nobody can really read all of this data at scale. And I've had a couple of posts recently, and I've written an article about it, about how my usage of Podchaser has changed significantly over the last 3 or 4 months. Still love Podchaser Pro, still use Podchaser Pro quite a bit. However, with now having this totality of data, and thanks to more of the agentic coding platforms, whether it's Claude Code, Codex, whatever you're using, Perplexity Computer, now we can take much larger swaths of data and build insights off of those swaths of data as a result of mirroring all of these disparate pieces. That you can still do a lot of that with Podchaser Pro. However, it becomes a lot more accessible, a lot more convenient, a lot more efficient when doing it through the API. So some of the backdrop for all of this is most of the things that you're going to see within this deck today, from the intelligence reads to some of the data, et cetera, are going to be enabled by tapping Podchaser's API. So we have a GraphQL API. I won't get into the weeds about what's the difference between GraphQL and other APIs, but we also introduced REST API, which is a little bit different, it's a little bit more lightweight, and we're working on an MCP. So don't worry, this isn't going to be me talking about coding. Most of it, what you guys are interested in is, of course, going to be the outputs, and that's what we're going to stick to. But all to say, when you can use a front-end interface like Podchaser Pro, and then also conjure more data through big data pulls using an API, it just opens up a lot more opportunities. And we're going to show you exactly how that works. So what is a Podchaser intelligence read? It turns a conversation into a decision. That's like the simplest way that I could describe it. So we run these analyses across the entire podcast ecosystem to answer where you show up, what people are saying, who do you want to reach, and it's a layer above that self-serve data that you get within Podchaser Pro. So some current stats. So 6.1 million shows within the data set that keeps growing, despite, the sometimes people are calling it the podcast peak. What is a podcast in 2026 and beyond, thanks to the introduction of video into the ecosystem, so on and so forth. There's about 406,000 podcasts that are still active. And just for sake of numbers, because this is something that'll still always come up, 722 is the number of podcasts that have an 80 power score or above. Power score, of course, is going to be our proprietary metric that looks at about 30 different data points, combines them all together, and really serves as a proxy for a podcast popularity, right? So if we're looking at 406,000 active podcasts, 722 of them have an 80 or above power score. You start doing some of the math, right? And I think the other reason why I wanted to put this number within this deck in particular is we know there are other media monitoring platforms out there that exist. We know that some of them offer podcast transcription. We know that they have monitoring products, obviously. But when we start to think about, well, most of them are doing maybe the top 1,500 shows. Some of them we've seen have even expanded top 10,000 shows and a little bit above. But when we talk about the totality of the podcast universe, 150,000 is a significant chunk, especially with verified measurement of reach. So, i.e., shows that have above a zero power score, for example, right? So, again, all these conversations are happening. All of this data is kind of at our fingertips. We just need to be able to plug into it, and that's what these intelligence reads are going to enable us to do. So, great. That's an intelligence read, but what does it actually mean? These are our six most common intelligence reads that we've been running, both internally as well as on behalf of clients. One point of note here, you can run these in concert, you can combine multiple, you can do Intel reads on all six of them at the same time if you desire. But the six most common ones and six most popular ones that we've seen so far are category intelligence, so where your category's conversation lives and whether it's growing. We were working with a client in the AI or a PR agency that works with a lot of the leading frontier AI models, right? And the AI models wanted to understand how much our AI tool is actually being discussed on podcasts. Well, let's run a category intelligence read and see where Google Gemini, Anthropic, OpenAI, Perplexity, so on and so forth are actually appearing in podcasts. And then we can take it a step further and look at share of voice and sentiment, which is going to be our second kind of category, second Podchaser intelligence read. So this looks at your brand versus competitors, how often, where, and what tone. One of the really interesting insights that we were able to glean from doing this project for this PR agency was that one of the top companies in AI, I won't name them because I think this is still kind of being worked out, but one of the top companies had a very low sentiment score. However, their product, the actual interface that the end users are actually working with on a day-to-day basis, had the highest sentiment score. So here's the company, way down low in terms of sentiment. It was, I think, negative 46, so negative sentiment of negative 46. And then the tool that people are actually using was like a plus 76. So what that shows is there's a huge gulf between the company and their product. And if you're in communications, if you're in PR, if you're in the greater media space, that obviously represents some problems, right? We know that the end users are loving the thing. However, there's distrust. There's a lot of fear around the company that's actually producing the product itself. And again, when you do this across tens of thousands of episode transcripts, I believe the number of episode transcripts that we combed through for this was about 81,000. So it wasn't a small sample size. This was a truly huge pull. And again, it offered some pretty instructive insights for this PR agency and how to advise their client moving forward. The third intelligence read is going to be audience validation. So this is going to look, of course, like demographics, affinities per show, and again, say we'll get into some very specific examples here in a minute. But if you wanted to target millennial moms, for example, what are millennial moms consuming in the podcast landscape? Which podcasts are talking about millennial moms? So maybe you can approach it from a different way. So again, this is an under the radar read that, yes, you could probably get through a Podchaser Pro poll. However, to sift through all of them and have it all in kind of one cohesive document would be a little bit difficult without having to export a ton of different sheets. The fourth one is going to be competitive ad intelligence. And while this is more often going to be of course, a paid media play, it's also really important from an earned media play because if you are representing a client and they are in category A and they want to go out and talk about their founding story, they want to talk about their upcoming product launch, so on and so forth. Understanding what the real ad footprint looks like among their competitive set is really important because if another company in category A, maybe that's their chief competitor, is sponsoring or kind of putting all of their budget into sponsoring the 10 shows that you think are going to be a really good fit from your client's earned media perspective, effectively what they're doing is now boxing you out of those conversations. Yes, we've seen where the podcast might not actually care if they have a representative from their program or from a company that's competitive to one of their sponsors appear. However, there more times than not, you probably want to avoid those types of situations. So what does that tell you as a communicator then? Well, if I'm getting boxed out or my client's getting boxed out of these 10 shows that we absolutely wanted to be on, how do we rework the angle? How do we rework the story? How do we tell a different narrative and maybe target different shows across a different category or a different subcategory? So again, understanding the competitive ad intelligence layer is really important. I think as you're building context for your pitches and hopefully earning more podcast guest appearances as well. The fifth one is going to be cultural moment timing. This one is really, really important in my opinion. We've talked for years now about how long it can take from podcast pitch to podcast saying yes to actually recording the episode versus when the episode actually goes live. So we'll have a very strong example of this a little bit further into the deck, but I mentioned back to school as we were talking about before at the top of the program. Back to school, of course, if we were to look at this, it's really July, September, or excuse me, July, August, September. My kids go back to school the second week of August, for example. If you were representing an ed tech company or a backpack brand, my kids just went shopping for backpacks at Target today. And you wanted to be part of that cultural conversation, the timing that you'd have to deploy in order to actually hit that kind of cultural tentpole moment of back to school season, you probably need to start doing the legwork on that in May or June or potentially even early July. So if we're going to take, a 3 week, 6 week, 12-week ramp period as we kind of head into this season, that's something you need to plan for. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, the back to school tentpole moment is in the rearview mirror. What will we be looking to next? Of course, here we are towards the end of July, which gives us August, September, October. What happens in October? The calendar flips, new season, and a lot of brands are going to start working on their Black Friday, Cyber Monday campaigns, and these are going to run from really early November, October, end of October through the December holiday season, right? So if you're working with folks that want to take advantage of the Black Friday, Cyber Monday window, now is probably a pretty good time to start thinking about this and getting them prepared for it. So again, we'll show a really interesting example of that. And then finally, talent and voice scouting. So identifying hosts and guests who carry your category. You can put them on partnership shortlists. These are the types of relationships you want to build before you ever have to send them, a truly cold pitch. We've had other guests on our webinar series before, such as Brittany Martin, who talks about just building the relationship and engaging with them on social media, becoming a known face in their circle, following their content, understanding and showing like real kind of authentic relationship building skills. So by the time you do make a pitch and you are trusted, it comes off a little bit easier as opposed to just cold pitching somebody because you need them to answer you within the next 6 days, for example, right? So again, talent and voice scouting is going to be a really important piece of this as well. So a read is built kind of along this process. The first thing we're going to do is ask a question. What decision are we going to inform? The second is the signal. So how much conversation actually exists and where does it move? The rooms. So this is going to be categories. These are going to be the shows that carry it. Sometimes we can even view a room as like a podcast network, for example. There are certain affinity networks that prioritize certain audience types, and maybe we want to prioritize that network based on what some of the data is going to tell us. Fourth is going to be the sentiment. So how is the conversation talked about? And specifically when we strip ad reads out. So this is a really important distinction because if we were only to do like a transcript analysis for brand A and all of those mentions were inclusive of their paid ads, Would we expect a paid ad for a brand to have a positive or negative sentiment? Ideally, a positive sentiment, right? So when you strip out the ad reads, what that allows you to do is see what the actual organic conversation looks like, and have a much more holistic view of sentiment from there. Fifth is going to be the audience, so who's actually listening. And this is important because when we think about, your favorite podcaster, you can name them, whoever it might be. While the podcaster's opinion doesn't necessarily represent their listener's opinion, the listeners are certainly influenced by the podcaster's opinion, right? So if a podcaster, let's use Giggly Squad as an example, if Paige and Hannah are trashing a certain fast food restaurant, while that might not end up showing up, such as now all of their followers or listeners are also trashing the program, maybe they'll look for competitive sets, or maybe they'll remember, oh, so and so wants to go to Taco Bell. Well, I remember Hannah and Paige were talking about their worst experiences at Taco Bell. Let's go to Wendy's instead. So again, these are more subliminal or subconscious. But as we can see through data that we've published before, as well as our parent company, Acast, um, the reason why podcasts are so effective is because of this trust proxy that exists. And it's really thanks to this parasocial relationship that exists between podcast hosts and their audiences. So while we're not measuring sentiment of listeners towards certain topics, brands, categories, etc., we are doing sentiment on the hosts that are actually talking about these. And again, there's that proximal relationship that exists between the hosts and their audiences. And then finally, the opening. So where is the white space? Where is the gap? How can we fit our client, our brand, into this overall kind of conversational intelligence? And then once we establish these 6 questions in order, the move, of course, is then to do an intelligence read. So again, I understand that this might be a little bit esoteric, which is why I wanted to give some real examples here. And these are all things that we've run in the last few months. And these are going to look like briefs. And actually, in some ways, you can almost view them as prompts, if you will. But uh, again, we'll send this out after the event today, so you can all see this. If you want to take screenshots, you're more than welcome to. But I'll just read through a few of them. So one of the biggest ones, of course, is going to be owning the narrative. So where is our categories narrative being shaped, and where are we in those rooms? So from a category perspective, I gave the example of all of the AI frontier models. They want to understand what that category actually looks like, who's showing up the most, where is the white space that exists within that. For example, in that report that we built, a lot of the thematic conversation around AI came down to two primary themes. One was workplace productivity, and on that, it actually scored quite high from a sentiment perspective. The other was job loss, and it scored quite low on that. And that's an interesting tension that exists. So those that are, as the data showed us, those that are using AI or adopting AI are feeling huge productivity gains. However, the general sentiment around AI wondered what happens when I can now do the work of 3 people thanks to these new tools. So again, if you're a brand in that space, how do you reconcile that tension, and what part of the narrative do you actually lean into? Second, of course, is going to be the share of voice. So how much of the conversations are we capturing versus competitors? We put our client on 10 shows. What did that reach? And did it move sentiment, especially relative to competing firms? These are all very much doable with these intelligence reads now. Where's our competitor showing up? Where is the gap that we can own? That's kind of like what I said before in context of doing the ad intelligence, but you can also do this from an organic perspective as well. Timing. So we announced in Q1, which shows we'll be ready and primed for that story. This is a really interesting one, especially when we're looking at it on a show-by-show basis. One of my favorite things to do now is to go through like my top 10 list of shows that I've already identified as being targets for the guest speaker or the podcast guest, and going deeper into the map of coverage from from an individual show on that top 10 list over the course of the last 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. One example is My First Million. It's a business podcast. It's on the HubSpot podcast network. It's hosted by Sean Puri and Sam Parr. And what's interesting is you start to get an intelligence readout on the topics that they've covered. 2025 was a ton of AI. 2024 was a ton of crypto, newsletters, alternative media, alternative content. Now in 2026, they've moved pretty heavily into investment strategies, reverse engineering how really successful people got there, and also interviewing those folks, et cetera. So again, seeing that narrative arc from an individual show is now quite accessible. Alyssa, I think I saw your hand up. Maybe it was a mistake. Accident. No problem. All good. Um, Another thing from a timing perspective, so if we see that the investment strategy arc is starting to pick up steam and it's starting to crest, and we've got a client that's a self-made millionaire, and this is how they've done it through an approach that they've taken, now might be a better time to pitch that as opposed to somebody who is making a ton of money off of newsletters, because we know that kind of peaked in 2024 for My First Million, right? So again, this is something that we can do now. Audience. So who's really listening to the shows that we keep pitching? See this time and time again. Obviously, it's accessible within Podchaser Pro. However, utilizing these intelligence reads helps us understand it a lot deeper. So guests and media lists, even when it comes down to identifying best fit shows. So again, we've given you a couple frameworks over the years: content, context, audience, and reach, the 4A's framework. You can take any of those, inject it into what we're trying to do here, whether that's part of a prompt or giving it context, and it's saying based on these factors and based on my guest bio, like what are the actual best shows for them to appear on. So I'll give another example with this, and this kind of blends into monitoring as well. But we're working with a professor at a highly distinguished uh, school of business here in the Midwest, and he's coming out with a new book. He didn't realize until we ran one of these intelligence reads for the media list that pulled in a variety of factors, but was also inclusive of shows that had discussed his previous book and or his research and or his name and department. And as it turned out, this individual, one of his seminal pieces of research was actually mentioned on the Mel Robbins podcast. And again, if you logged into Podchaser Pro, you'll see Mel Robbins appear at the top of many lists, whether that's charts or Power Score or what have you. And if we hadn't have done that, he'd have no idea that one of the world's biggest podcasts had talked about his work organically, glowingly, in the past. So as we start to develop the media list for him or the hit list for him, guess what's going to be near the top of the list? Of course, it's going to be Mel Robbins, right? So again, this is something that you could have done before using exact phrase match searches. If you have transcript search enabled, you probably could have seen this, but being able to do it at scale is where I think it becomes quite interesting. Category intelligence I already talked quite a bit about, so I think we'll leave that one there. But author and book placement. I'm listening when you guys participate in these webinar formats. I think almost always somebody from the book publishing world says, "What about my authors? How do I do this for my authors?" So I wanted to make sure we included it directly within this content as well. But we know in the book publishing world, there's 3 seasons, right? And if we want to align our author with the publishing seasons, how do we do that? That could be looking at something like which book podcasts have interviewed the most fantasy authors or the most sci-fi authors. Which podcasts have interviewed the most authors who've written books for kids. So again, we can now start to query this a little bit further, and that's one of the benefits of doing this with an LLM as opposed to just doing it with Pro or toggling back and forth between the two, is there's so much more context that exists. So we can look at the best-selling children's books over the last 2 years, and we can now pinpoint where each of those authors, where their publishers have appeared on podcasts, and then kind of reverse engineer if that's the case, well, what shows should we actually be on? So again, this is going to be an intelligence read that you could have done with simply Pro. However, in the spirit of efficiency and cohesiveness, it's a lot more accessible now. So your turn. what would you want to read on? You can drop a brand, category, or competitor in the chat. We'll come back to them. I don't know if we're going to do them live today, but we'll definitely get to them or talk to your client success manager, and we'll get that pulled for you. So throw it in the chat, throw it in the DM, ask your client success manager, and we will be happy to give you a free pull. So this is where it's going to get to the read in action stage of it. So this is going to be a real read that I pulled, and I did it from a variety of different angles. So when we think about the six intelligence reads that I put up before, it's going to cover most of them. And I already kind of referenced this before, but this is going to be the holiday gift season. So I did this looking in arrears, so looking back to 2025, but we could also do this from a predictive standpoint, based on new current trends, the current cultural zeitgeist, so on and so forth. But for the sake of this demonstration, I wanted to do it looking back, because I think it helps. So this is going to be the first one. This is going to be timing. This is going to be the cultural kind of tentpole category that we looked at before. So Gift Talk on podcast, it basically runs on a clock. And what we can see through this is very, very, very dormant. We see mentions of, and just so you know, like the actual transcript language we looked for were gift guides, stocking stuffer, holiday gifts, gift ideas. It's You can go a lot further beyond that. We can condense that even further if you wanted to, but just for the sake of the example, those are the keywords that we used. What you can see here is it starts to tick up a little bit come September after a very dormant kind of summer window. And even when we look at this, so like May and June, those are a little bit higher just because that's dads and grad season. That's reflected. But as we kind of start to crescendo here into December, all of a sudden the conversation becomes quite noisy. And if I were a brand that had a gift that was primed to be, a holiday best pick or what have you, I wouldn't start laying that groundwork in October. Certainly not in November, and by December it's way too late. I'd probably start having conversations with podcasts next week. And while we all bemoan the fact that most podcasts don't have editorial calendars, and if they do, they certainly don't make them publicly available like some of our digital publishers do, now is a really good time to start building those relationships because almost all of the types of podcasts, categories of podcasts you'd want to be on are going to devote some of their editorial calendar to the gift giving season. All right. So um, these are, this is not just let's do this and let it run. This is let's understand it. So, like if the podcast host is a brand ambassador for a competitive product, obviously we'd want to remove them from the set. But this slide is here to emphasize the fact that the timing matters a lot. And based on some of the timelines that we see, we need to start having conversations with podcasts in advance of the gift giving season. We can't just kind of parachute in and expect to get good results. This is another one. So this is going to be part of the rooms. So Gift Talk isn't a shopping aisle. It's literally everywhere. So this is looking at podcasts by category from October to December 2025. It's going to index quite highly with general interest shows and not necessarily family or kids niche. So depending on the product, depending on the brand you're working with, of course, there's going to be exceptions to this rule, but I think what this kind of illustrates here is you need to have a multi-pronged approach. So just because you're representing a brand or working with a brand in a given niche, let's say it's kids' toys, for example. So my youngest is 2.5. She's starting to get into different things than she did when she was 1.5. However, getting a brand that wanted to target 2.5 to 3-year-olds, she'll be 3 by the time I guess Christmas rolls around, but it might not happen on a news or a culture or a society podcast, but we know that kids and family are underweight when it comes to some of the gifting conversation. So I might actually prioritize, again, in this very hypothetical example, family and kids podcasts. Maybe it's a learning toy. Maybe it's a retro type of thing. As we see, this would be an interesting one to kind of part to overlay on top of this is non-tech gifts. Obviously, Toy Story 5, which came out, took a very strong stance on the cultural zeitgeist of toys versus tech. We see a lot of anti-tech and kids scenarios, whether it's social media bans or returning to more analog types of toys and games. So maybe that's something that we can also put on as an overlap from this perspective as well. So all to say, this is helping us build a timing map, a category map. And if we wanted to go even further, obviously we can layer on the analog versus digital or analog versus tech or these types of things as well. So sentiment, and this one we're actually using a real brand. So what we're going to look at here is uh, mentions of Laneige. I don't know if that's exactly how you say it. I think my wife has that product. Sol de Janeiro, which I know my wife does have. Both of these products were sold at Sephora or Ulta as a gift set. So, and then if also we look at the Dyson Airwrap, which was another of 2025's most wanted gifts or most purchased gifts. What this helps us understand is whether something was adored or second guessed. And this one in particular is about the Dyson Airwrap. So 53% of the mentions of the Airwrap were positive. However, 47% questioned it. So again, if I'm coming to market or my clients come to market with a competitive product to the Dyson Airwrap, there's a lot of value in the love it, so we can understand why these podcast hosts, why these producers enjoyed the Dyson Airwrap. But I think there's actually a lot more intelligence you could glean from those that questioned it. And as you're coming to market, if some of the sentiment of the conversation was around how long the cord was to actually plug in the wall to use the charging component to it. Well, if I'm coming to market, say, hey, this is you don't have to plug it in anywhere. It's a self-charging system, whatever the case might be. I'm really reaching here on this example because I don't know much about the Dyson Airwrap. But you, point being, you can glean additional insights from the positive sentiment to the questionable sentiment. And this is very similar to what brands are actually doing with Amazon reviews or Google reviews or social listening tools. They're identifying which pieces are great, which pieces are not, and you can get a ton more consumer insight based on what's not liked about a product sometimes, and you even can from what's enjoyed about a product. So with this, we can see some real kind of snippets here. So Hot Girl Energy podcast, one of my favorites. 100% worth the hype. It's made a huge difference. She spends, he saves. Was that an investment or a want? It's not an investment. Am I the jerk? I bought my girlfriend a Dyson Airwrap. Now she's mad, and that's from story time. So again, all what we can do. Krishna, I missed the part of this. Can you please send me the recording? Yep. Everybody who registered will get the recording and the deck. This is going to be competitive ad intelligence. So this is looking at the holiday gift set ad episodes that we talked about with the Sol de Janeiro products, Ulta and QVC, as well as Target. And why this is important too is to understand again the total landscape that we're working with, right? So Ulta indexed really highly with sports, which is an interesting anomaly out of all of these. We can go a layer deeper and see like what was the dimension of that. And what we would see is Ulta did an interesting thing where they actually targeted male identifying gifters of these gift sets. And that's something that Target did not do, QVC did not do. So when it comes to diversifying the types of audiences you're reaching, I think that was actually a fairly smart play from Ulta and probably was a more cost sensitive one as well, which is interesting. Whereas what's interesting is like health um, didn't index very well for any of these, which you'd expect health, wellness, beauty kind of all meld together into a larger conversation about these things. They basically went untouched. So this is where we would say this is a very clear white space. A lot of reasons for that. Maybe it's not necessarily audience alignment. Maybe it's saturation of organic mentions of a product, that sort of thing. But what this again is able to help you understand is where are some of the plot points where competitors are not, and then how do we fill those with our brand, with our narrative as well. So what this read, all of the various facets of it, tell a brand to do. You want to be in market by October, which means, of course, you're going to need to start a lot of these processes in September or even into August. We saw a 5x kind of crescendo from summer months into the very deepest parts of the conversation tranches. Showing up in mainstream shows, of course, is big, as we saw through the market map. And then you want to earn it, not just crowd it. So every retailer's buying the same broad reach. Earned conversation is scarcer, and it's where real opinion forms. So again, some of these things need to be multifaceted. You wouldn't make a decision about where to deploy your campaigns based on any one individual slide, but when you take all of the slides in kind of aggregate, what that's going to do is give you a much more informed way of approaching the campaign as opposed to just blindly saying, hey, we want to be on culture and news podcasts that reach women age 25 to 34. Let's go find the most suitable ones for us within Podchaser Pro. So now, again, we want to imagine this from your brand, your category, your competitor, your clients, and hopefully build a map around that. So while we did talk a lot about the paid stuff, we talked a lot about kind of the market mapping. How does this specifically work for like podcast guest booking, which we know is obviously going to be a huge use case for most of our clients. Again, there's probably four main ways to look at this. One is from a targeting perspective, so pitching best fit shows. They want to find shows where clients are already mentioning or podcasts are already mentioning our clients. We've seen this play out time and time again, whether it was the nonprofit webinar that we did, where an individual podcast talked about a new white paper that was produced by one of these nonprofits. The media relations gentleman reached out to the podcast, said, thanks for talking about my CEO's white paper. 2 days later, the CEO appears as a guest on the podcast. We talked about that in a couple other webinars as well. But if somebody's already positively speaking about your brand and from an organic perspective, lean into it. Get your client booked as a guest on those podcasts who can talk about it even further. So we want to find those warmer areas of opportunity where we don't have to necessarily go out and cold pitch, or it's not going to require us to have a 3-month goodwill campaign, building a relationship with a podcast host or a producer in advance of when you actually really need stuff to go live. Which again, if we're looking at this from the backdrop of cultural tentpole moments, when those are now, and we know that we need to have, kind of build those out weeks, if not months in advance. And that's where the time comes in, right? So pitch when your client's topic is starting to peak. I wouldn't say peaking, but as that's starting to grow and build, because that can help ride that conversation even further. And then angle, I think is the biggest one. I think it's what's separating a lot of yeses from no responses in most podcast guest pitches. And I'm not going to go too deep into the 4A's framework today, just because it's not the intention of this. But when we look at actionable versus analytical, anthropological versus aspirational, let's again say that you are working with a client that's in the kid toys manufacturing space. Let's use Magnetiles as an example because they're in my backyard and they're all over my house. So if I was working with Magnetiles, I wouldn't necessarily want to pitch my client, the CEO of Magnetiles, on an entrepreneurship show in Q4 of 2026. While it's great, we would obviously love to hear the founding journey at some point in time. My real goal is to talk about maybe the educational advancements, the creativity that gets unlocked when kids play with Magnetiles as opposed to technology, screens, devices, that sort of thing. So instead of going and pitching the entrepreneurial angle to entrepreneurial shows that are largely going to be aspirational, I might actually talk about anthropological and might also talk about analytical. And if they have a behavioral scientist or a cognitive development person on staff, or they're following research papers, that sort of thing, you can see kids that spend time building things are more likely to succeed in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. What better way to get your your child prepared for the rigors of academia than by getting them a set of magnet tiles so they can unlock that creative outlet and become fulfill the potential that they have academically, right? So that might be one way to approach it. And then finally, scout. So see which shows book experts like your client and which relevant ones book none. Again, sticking with the magnet tiles example. Let's say it's a pedagogical. My wife's a teacher. She would probably hit me for not being able to pronounce that. But if it's a show that features exclusively conversations about pedagogy, and you had a much more scientific approach to toys and how it's building this creative capacity within children, the CEO might not actually be the best fit for that podcast. It could be the director of learning and development. It could be a science-based researcher that you have on staff to talk about some of these things in much greater detail. So, case in point, my son plays baseball. He's going to be 8. He was diagnosed with an eye condition when he was 1 year old. He wears glasses. He's been wearing glasses since he was 1 year old. He really loves baseball. I'm his baseball coach. When I get some content in my feed, a lot of it's about baseball coaching, but then all of a sudden I started to get something in my For You page, which is about eye training in baseball. And there's this guy, he's a neuroscientist, and he uses this device, basically a string, and you have like 6 different balls on it, and it teaches kids to how to focus faster. Because if you can focus faster on the balls and the string, it leads to better performance in games. And he cites studies from Air Force Academy and a different college that introduced this training. Well, I happen to see this on my Instagram page, but if I was listening to a podcast about sports performance and coaching, and the founder of this company talked about it and said, "Yeah, it's the greatest product in the world. It's helping improve all these outcomes." That's all fine and well. But what I'd really like to hear is how it works and the science behind it. So actually, a more medically inclined guest would probably go even further for me in convincing me to purchase it. Incidentally, this device is about $10 on Amazon, so we're not talking huge numbers here. But again, when we think about scouting and mapping and trying to put talent together and creating a really symbiotic relationship between the podcast host and your guest, who are both there to serve the audience, this is where talent scouting becomes quite important. So again, this isn't a gift season demo. It's actually how we work. We've done this for global beauty retailers. We've done this for DTC shapewear companies. We've done this for Fortune 500 comms teams, national advertisers. Because there's so much data and because the data alone is not what separates it. It's contextualizing all of this data with the point of answering one of the questions or the big question, like we did kind of through that 6-step process. So, again, I think this fundamentally changes the way that at least I approach podcast data. Um, Again, we were able to do a lot of this in silos previously through the on-site platform that we call Podchaser Pro, but being able to take all of these disparate data points and then meld them together into one kind of cohesive report is where we start to see real unlock happen. And it's changed the way that we even interface with our own data. So it's a pretty cool thing. So where these reads actually take you, again, you can do a lot of this through Podchaser Pro. You can do this yourself, or we can do it for you. On the DIY side, it's most accessible through the Podchaser API. So again, we've got the GraphQL, which is we consider more of an enterprise grade API tooling, but we also have the REST API, which can be added to your account, that sort of thing. If you don't know what REST or GraphQL is, no problem. I didn't either before, call it March of this year. I was very much kind of in the anti-AI camp until I started playing around with these things, and all of a sudden I was getting answers to questions that I've had in the whole 5 years that I've been working at Podchaser. And man, wouldn't it be great if I could find out which podcasts are most popular with men aged 25 to 34 that have an interest in baseball and have young kids? I always wanted to be able to answer that question and do so quickly. Now I can. So consider me a true believer in being able to take all this data now. And again, on the done for you side, talk to your client success manager. Please, if you want a sample or an example, we'd be happy to pull that for you as well, just so you can start to see how cool this actually looks, and how it basically builds your roadmap within the podcast medium specifically. So, what would you want to read on? What would you want the market to tell you? Give us the brand category audience you're deciding on, and we will run the read. And that is our call to action for today. Please take us up on this offer, and we'd be happy to pull one of these for you. Questions, comments, ideas as we round out the last 10 minutes here? Jules, I know you've been doing some of this intelligence work as well. Anything worth sharing? Yes, a ton. Oh, cool. Um, well, if you have any questions, again, talk to your client success manager. If you're not a Podchaser client at this point in time, you want to reach out with some questions, you can email me, Trent at podchaser.com. Again, the emphasis here is all of this data, all of these, 6 million podcasts, all of the audience data, all the reach data, uh, in a silo, they work and they work great, and they have worked for the last 7, 8 years. Podchaser has been around. But when we start to combine them and create novel or unique data points and data sets from aggregating these insights together, this is going to help us really build a roadmap that's going to lead to our success within the podcast landscape. So, um, with that, I will bid you adieu. Again, the recording will be out. The deck will go with that. And of course, this will go on our YouTube channel as well. So, Katie Beth, super helpful. Thank you. Excited to dive in. Great for planning on podcast pitches for clients, especially on a larger scale. Yeah, absolutely. The scale side of this is, I think, where it becomes quite interesting. So, cool. Any questions, just let me know, and hopefully everybody has a great weekend.